This is the Expert Series podcast from the CDA Institute, Canada's premier defense and security think tank. I'm Josh Malm, and it's Friday, December 19th, 2025. This is the final episode of the Expert Series for 2025. This episode caps off Season 4 of the Expert Series. And before we dive into today's discussion, I want to take a moment to reflect on some of the progress we've made over the year. For those who follow us regularly, or if you're just tuning in, it's been an exciting time for the CDA Institute and for Canadian defense and security more broadly. In my 6 years with the Institute, this has arguably been the most consequential year yet. And as many of our listeners will know, this marks the 4th year I've had the privilege of hosting and producing the CDA Institute's Expert Series podcast. We're a small team and a small channel, but this year has been a standout for us. We've seen our highest audience growth to date with over 1,500 new subscribers and an average of about 1,000 views per episode. While these numbers are modest by some standards, they're a significant achievement for us, and they're a testament to, I think, the growing interest in Canadian defense, but also a reflection of the work we put into learning, improving, and adapting to bring you, our listeners, better content. When we launched this program 4 years ago, growth was slow, and our audience was very small, but today, we're seeing steady growth year after year, and we expect that trend to continue into the new year. We've got a lot of exciting episodes and guest appearances lined up, along with plans to continue improving our production capabilities and processes. As always, we'll continue listening to your feedback to make the listening experience even better. So thank you for your support. Whether you're a subscriber or first-time listener, we really appreciate you taking the time to tune in week after week. Now, on to today's episode. 2025 has been a pivotal year for Canadian defense. At the start of the year, the election of Donald Trump marked a notable shift in the international security environment, leading to changes that have impacted not only Canada, but NATO allies, and arguably the broader post-war security consensus. The reliability of the United States as an ally is increasingly questioned, an issue that may persist regardless of the direction of American leadership in the near future. This shift arguably influenced Canada's 2025 federal election, which saw Mark Carney become Prime Minister. In his time in office, Carney has introduced several defense-related initiatives, the appointment of a Secretary of State for Defense, the introduction of a defense industrial strategy, CAF pay raises, efforts to diversify Canada's alliances, and increased involvement in European defense initiatives like ReArm Europe. In addition, Budget 2025, which was recently passed, allocated over $80 billion in new defense spending initiatives. We also saw the downselection to Hanwha Ocean and TKMS for the submarine replacement project, and the Army's Army Modernization Plan. Arguably the biggest announcement of the year was Canada's commitment at the NATO Summit this past summer to meet the 2% defense spending target by the end of 2025, with the goal of 5% by 2035. The year also saw the continued war in Ukraine, along with the growing use of drones and autonomous systems, ongoing threats posed by Russia to Europe, rising tensions in the South China Sea, and the conflict in the Middle East, particularly the war in Gaza. As our panelists will discuss, the most influential factor in global defense and security in 2025 has arguably been the shifts caused by President Trump's administration. The uncertainties generated by these changes have created notable challenges for Canada and its allies. Without further ado, we'll now move into today's episode, and we'll begin with a discussion featuring General Tom Lawson, former Chief of the Defense Staff and Chair of the CDA Institute Board, followed by a conversation with Dr. Rob Hubert, CDA Institute Fellow, and we'll close this year with reflections from Wendy Gilmour, CDA Institute Vice Chair, and former NATO Assistant Secretary General for Defense Investment. We hope you enjoy today's episode. Thanks for joining us for the CDA Institute's annual yearly reflection podcast. It's a real pleasure and privilege to be joining you this morning.
Pleasure's mine, Josh. There's plenty to talk about in defense and security issues, and some of it's even positive.
Well, I look forward to hearing your reflections. I think many commentators might say that it's been quite an historic year for Canadian defense and security. We've had lots of developments, lots of challenges, but also lots of opportunities. General Lawson, if we could look back maybe all the way to January of this year and kind of track some of these developments, when it comes to defense and security, what would you say were some of the most notable or consequential developments of this year?
Yeah. Well, I agree there were a lot of developments, but there's absolutely no doubt which was the most consequential for Canada. That came in June when Prime Minister Carney announced that we'd be raising our defense investment to 2% of gross domestic product by the end of the current fiscal year. I mean, that's an injection of an unexpected amount of more than $10 billion. And then there were further announcements later in the month that pointed to even greater investments in defense over the coming decade to 3.5% or 5% when you include defense-related spendings in other sectors. And it's pretty clear that this wasn't just a budget announcement. What the Prime Minister did in that first speech was to try and change, I think, how Canadians think about defense investment. The new narrative is no longer that defense dollars simply provide some level of insurance against, the evils of the world, but more that defense investment will be a tool going ahead for Canadian prosperity. And, whether this doctrine holds up or not, whether Canadians are going to continue to see their armed forces not only as protectors, but as engines of economic well-being, that's to be seen. But for those of us who have long advocated for this sort of increased defense investment, like the entire team at CDAI for many decades, we're pretty heartened by the government's new intent and direction. So I think that's the most consequential development that came about over the last year.
Would you say that Canada's priorities changed or evolved over the course of the year? And if so, I'm wondering if you might be able to reflect on some of the factors that drove some of these changes.
Yeah. Well, from a national point of view, government point of view, strategic, I think the government has changed the discussion from one, as I say, of defense as a necessary annual cost to one where defense investment's going to lead to a resurgence in national industry and trade. And certainly this level of investment is going to help make clear to the U.S. and to our NATO allies that we're serious about defense capabilities and that that's going to address what had really become a very sore point amongst that crowd for a decade or more. As for the Canadian Armed Forces, I don't really think the priorities have changed. And what I mean by that is that, successive chiefs of defense, lots before me and lots after me, we had a pretty good idea of what we needed for the Canadian Armed Forces to be viable. We needed to build back our personnel numbers, buy spare parts for our many fleets, and invest in our national defense infrastructure, our wings, our bases, and our piers. And we also knew what we should have been doing if we had the money to develop key capacities, like things like refurbishing NORAD defenses, buying air defense capabilities for our deployed troops, developing a really substantial cyber defense. But we didn't have the money. The difference is that now, and at least for the next while the government remains committed to these investments, the money's going to be there to allow these things to happen.
Asking you to make a prediction here, General Lawson, but do you see this level of interest and movement from both the government and even the public sustainable in the medium term? There's been a lot of movement, a lot of investments and announcements, but do you think this is a sea change in Canadian defense and security, or is it possibly more of a short-term trend, if you will?
Well, we've seen some significant announcements and investments in the past, but mostly they were domestically driven. 1988 and Prime Minister Mulroney with Perrin Beatty as defense, all kinds of things, including nuclear stubs, and that fell flat within a year. But this one is driven externally, as well as internally, of course, but externally by geopolitics and the world becoming a rougher place. So in answer to your question, I'm going to predict this is going to last longer, at least, than what we've seen in the past, because it has to. But I think that how long this lasts for is going to be partly dependent on whether or not the Prime Minister's drive to make this the kindling for a resurgence in industry. If that works out, this thing could build momentum. And then I think that we will see this start to become more of a sea change and a new national security policy going forward.
You brought up the external and the influence of the external events around us and the world changing rapidly. I wonder if you might be able to reflect on international events and geopolitical developments this year and maybe describe which developments have impacted Canada the most?
Well, clearly autocratic powers like Russia and China are becoming more aggressive, less constrained by international rules. I mean, Russia's savage war against Ukraine is criminal, but it does help to focus the Canadian Armed Forces and our operations in Latvia and Canada's focus on material and financial support to Ukraine. And China's wielding their military and economic might in ways that we might not have predicted a few years ago. Taiwan is clearly in their sights. And that could turn into a second hot war in just a couple of years' time. And all of this is happening as U.S. policy becomes harder and harder to figure out. I mean, is the U.S. committed to NATO and to Article 5, or are they slowly pulling out? Is it the long goodbye? Or are they pro-democracy? Are they pro-autocrat? I mean, it's really hard to tell. And on top of all these threats, the Canadian Arctic is a persistent and growing strategic concern, again, because of growing threats from Russia and China, and some might even think from the U.S. So those things are external or challenges and geopolitical developments that impact us. But of course, there are many really significant internal challenges for the Minister and the Chief of Defense to deal with. Personnel numbers are well below where they should be in both the regular forces and reserves, and we have lots of aging equipment leading to low serviceability rates. So that means that Canadian Armed Forces readiness is well below what it should be at a time when we need it to be at least what the establishment sets it at. But you know what? The Minister and the Chief know all these things that I'm speaking about. They're working on them. We hear about it in the periodicals. The external challenges I've mentioned, largely China and Russia, they provide really strong motivation for this investment and all of these new funds to be focused on these internal challenges. But if I really had to focus, Josh, on one development over all the others, it would be this unbelievable rapid transformation of the United States from reliable world leader and close ally into something entirely different. And if it was simply an American trend towards isolationism, that would be one thing. But I don't think that's what's happening. With support from Congress and the Supreme Court, or at least resignation on their parts, this president has treated allies like Canada abominably and thrown long-established norms into utter chaos. Now, you read as some observers think this will make the democratic world more resilient in the long run, because it's clearer and clearer to them that they're pretty much on their own in facing Russia and China. So defense investments are climbing all over the world, especially in countries that once thought the U.S. would guarantee their security, like Canada. But I don't see much to celebrate here. There simply is no other country that can take the lead in the way the U.S. has done over the last 7 years. And their leadership benefited every country that believed in a world where laws meant something. But President Trump has shown little interest in international law, little interest in friends and allies. And for some reason, the nation follows him down this increasingly chaotic path. So I think that's the international event of greatest impact over the last year for us and for the rest of the world.
Well, I think most commentators and people observing would agree with you, General Lawson. And as you'll know, the national security strategy was released just a few weeks ago. So it's interesting to reflect on to what extent President Trump was involved in that, and to what extent it will be implemented or executed. So I suppose we will all find out in the coming years. You've been great, General Lawson, for these past few minutes, reflecting on the year in defense. I think you've really hit the nail on the head in a lot of instances. Looking ahead, and you may have already answered this question just now, what issues or developments are going to matter into the new year? And might you be able to reflect on some of the challenges, developments, or decisions that we need to watch for in the new year and beyond?
Well, again, let's look outwardly and then inwardly. Externally, a lot really depends, as you just said, in the path the U.S. takes in the coming year. In Congress or the Senate or the House back to the Democrats, that could allow them or both to rein in some of the president's most destructive tendencies and perhaps return the U.S. to something a little bit closer to what they once were. So things could become a little steadier around the world. I mean, there's little chance we're ever going to return to a world in which the U.S. provides the moral leadership to the democratic nations of the world the way they once did. Too much has been broken over the last year. But if the U.S. stays in NATO and toughens their stance, for instance, on Russia and maybe China, then there may be something for the free world to celebrate. Looking inwardly here in Canada, we should see the publication of the new defense industrial strategy, if it hasn't come out by the end of today. And I think that's going to provide certainly the direction and some of the fuel for the Defense Investment Agency that we know has stood up. It'll allow them the fuel and direction to make some big moves. So, at least I hope so. And if that happens, then we might have the makings of the defense industry renewal that the Prime Minister is pushing for. And if that happens, then we may see some of this sea change that you were asking about earlier. But meanwhile, for no matter how long this sticks around, this investment, the Canadian Armed Forces is set to make hay while the sun shines. Recruitment efforts are paying off with the new pay and benefits, and they're starting to fill holes. They're growing again. The bases and the personnel pay and the benefits, those things are being reinvested in already, and new air fleets are set to arrive. New Army vehicles and Army weaponry we're hearing about in articles every day. And shipbuilding plant. Hard to believe, but it's set to start bearing fruit. Look, I'll finish off with this, Josh. If I was young again and looking for a job right now, I'd either be considering joining defense in a uniform again or finding a slot in defense industry, because that's where the national focus will be for at least the next year or two, and probably for a few years after that.
Well, General Lawson, thank you for your reflections. Thank you for taking some time this morning. I'm glad we were able to get you on the podcast. It's been a privilege speaking with you today. And I just want to let you know, I think our audience is going to derive a great deal of value from your reflections and thought leadership here. So thank you very much. And also happy holidays as well. For this portion of the episode, I'm joined by the great Rob Hubert once again. Dr. Huebert, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, it's always my pleasure, Josh.
So for this podcast, we've been speaking with board members like General Tom Lawson, Wendy Gilmour, asking them for their reflections and looking back on the year. So Rob, for you, when it comes to defense and security this year, what do you think were maybe the most notable or consequential developments that occurred since January 2025?
It's the obvious one. It's sort of the cliche, beware of what you wish for, you may get it. And amongst defense analysts, watchers, policymakers, we always had this little bit of a wish that the Canadian public would take defense more serious, that we could have the type of engagements and discussions that we've seen that have filled a full year. But of course, we all know what the reason is, and probably the most significant event that we saw was the election of a very, very vengeful Trump administration that was determined to do it only his way, and that included with all sorts of ramifications that it carried over for Canada. I mean, literally from when he returns back into the office, we see so many of the core assumptions that underline Canadian defense policy just turned on its ear. And I think that has been probably the most significant event. But it leads to the second event, and that is where I was making slightly light of it, is that we've seen a proliferation of discussion and debate and policy promises on defense that is difficult to find since the end of the Cold War, and even during most of the later half of the Cold War. And so I think that the pronouncements of annexation, the tariffs, and many of the other policy developments that the Trump administration has engaged upon has forced us to have that engagement within ourselves in terms of what it actually means. Now, the third element is, of course, the ongoing issues that we see in terms of the use of force in Eastern Europe, and that is, of course, the Russian continuance use of their war against Ukraine, in the Asia Pacific region, the continuous buildup of the Chinese forces, the increase of the exercises the Chinese are launching against Taiwan, with the clear understanding that we are probably going to be seeing war in that region sooner rather than later. And so ultimately, it leaves us with this reality that Canada is in one of the most dangerous geopolitical environment that it has faced, I would argue, almost since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The array of factors that are now developing really point to the possibility of some form of major war occurring in a relatively soon. And of course, ultimately for Canada, the question becomes, is Canada prepared? Are we ready for what is going to be, I think, a disastrous set of events within the international systems, and particularly for the security of Canada?
Thanks for that overview, Rob. As you'll know, also the 2025 National Security Strategy came out a few weeks ago. Keeping this in mind, that you also wrote our most recent strategic outlook, which came out in March, which was very much reflecting on the election of President Trump and what that would mean for Canadian defense and security. So with these things said, I'm wondering if you had a chance to look at the national security strategy, and I'm curious what you think about it, and generally within Trump's first year of his second administration, has it been worse than you anticipated? Has it been about what you anticipated, or is this another answer there in the ether?
Well, I think you can hold me to account, but I think I got a pretty good accurate prediction of what Trump was going to do. I mean, the indications were really early that he was going to take upon this term to eliminate any of the guardrails that seemed to have kept most of his policies reasonable within the first term. You know, there was no real major move away from NATO. There was strong support for the Ukrainians. It seemed business as usual. But I think at least I was able to accurately predict that he was going to be unleashing forces that were going to be very unsettling for Canada. And I think on that part, I think I got it right. In terms of the national security strategy, my God, I mean, I've been in this game for a long time. I've read a lot of the national security policies of Western countries, and I mean, you can think of Canada, strong, secure, and engaged. We spend first two chapters really talking about our social values. There's a very strong emphasis on sort of principles of EDI, and we say, okay, well, that's what countries can do. They can sort of do a bit of an expression of who they are, and then they get serious in the latter chapters. In terms of format, the national security strategy does that. I mean, but those first two chapters are terrifying. I mean, the only thing I can think of is it was written maybe by the defense team for the North Koreans. I mean, it was all hail the great leader. The great leader has solved everything in the international system, and if the great leader is only listened upon, the international system will be live happily ever after. I mean, I think the thing that was the most chilling for me, and I saw a lot of my colleagues kind of trying to paper it over because I mean, it's just so confounding. But if you've written this policy, you've been able to basically enforce literally the voice of what the great leader is saying. That illustrates just how much the influence of his thinking. And we know that there are all sorts of questions in terms of his cognitive capabilities. One example is not related to defense, but his rant against Reiners after his death. I mean, it was all about me, and it's a good thing that, he caused it because he spoke against me. And we see this reflective in the policy. And then if you get into the actual so-called substance, and I have difficulty calling it substance, you then have a look, and it's just basically, hey, we are going to be isolationists. We're going to take control of the Western Hemisphere. rule of law really isn't going to matter anymore. Countries that can't quite get used to us, you better get used to us. And I think that was very much written against Mexico and us. And basically Russia, China, go do what you want to go do in your sphere of influence. Just don't interfere with us. And I mean, we already see the reorganization of the U.S. military. So this isn't some empty promise or some ego trip where he gets to just say, hey, look, I put my stamp on the national security strategy. The fact that they're already moving to reorganize the structure of the U.S. military. And this is, of course, after following where they removed most of the senior where is this going? And for me, it demonstrates, first of all, he does what he says he's going to do. And what he says he's going to do, I think, it should be very alarming for Canadians.
Trump, at least for me in my lifetime, I mean, I don't think in my relatively short life, I don't think I've seen a politician with the kind of gravitas and just the sheer political animalism of Trump. He's so charismatic to many, and like despite the awful, terrible things he says, he's quite a political force. And I mean, he even said it on his first campaign, and I think it kind of holds true. Sadly, he could, I think, shoot someone on Fifth Avenue or something, and they would still elect him. So, I mean, he's just a big political figure with so much influence. And Rob, I guess I'm asking, we're all wondering, does Trumpism outlive Trump and continue without him, or do you need that kind of figurehead of Trump driving Trumpism? Like, does this national security strategy outlive Trump, or does Trump, move on or pass away, die, whatever you want to call it, and there's a recalibration? Or do you think there's some roots here that are a little deeper?
Well, I think there's two roots that are very deep. The first one is, of course, is that the second term is very clear in the last year that he's restructuring so much of the institutions. I mean, he's been very successful with the legal branch of the American system. I mean, part of that was luck, having Supreme Court justices that were more or Democrat oriented dying during his term, so that he could then stack it with his appointees. And the fact that he really doesn't care about sort of the existing rules of the game. It was just simply, as you put it, how does he find expression for his own interest and power? And there's no element that has meant, and we go back to the restructuring of the U.S. military. So he's restructuring the military, he's restructuring the bureaucracy, he's restructuring the judiciary. I mean, all of this means that whoever follows him is going to either have that to their benefit, or they're going to have to spend probably all their term trying to return things to normal. And it's hard to think of the political motivation for an individual to do that. There'll be the temptation. If you're a Democrat, you'll want to get revenge for everything that's been bestowed upon you. And if you're a Republican, you're probably going to want to pretend that you are the successor to Trump. So that's an institutional long term. The second thing that he has changed, and it gets to your point on charisma. Once again, I have difficulty with that, but you probably, there's a certain element of truth to it. But I'd say that where his political, I know he is a genius, but I mean what he's shown in both business and in politics is that he has an instinctive ability of knowing exactly where the weak points of his opponent are. And he doesn't care if there's any sort of, well, why are you accusing Biden of falling asleep and, Sleepy Joe? And he got no problem falling asleep in all of your cabinet ministers, and no one calls you out for it. And he learned very quickly, if he wanted to control the Republican Party, all he had to do is get access to a lot of money, which he has, and control the nomination process. Anybody steps out of line, he then pays for someone to take him on. Those are systematic changes that I think any successor is going to try to keep. And if they keep that, then of course the policies will maintain themselves. Now, there is an argument that even amongst the Republican, there is no other Trump. And we often see this with, as you put it, charismatic leaders that somehow are able to rise to a level that nobody else within the party. So does a Vance, does anybody else that's within the Republican Party have that ability to attract that attention? And I mean, even if we go to political authoritative leaders from history, remember that Attila the Hun and many of these other charismatic leaders that seemingly rise out of anywhere, Alexander the Great. The big problem is the succession of them when they've amassed so much power. And so that the third point would be, basically from a historical perspective, such leaders usually don't have someone that is followed and able to maintain it. But again, these are so unusual times. It's difficult to know. And the fourth factor is he's unleashing forces all across the international security environment. What's the long-term effects of that? If say, for example, China in the immediate future, perhaps even while he's still in office, what happens if, in fact, that they attack Taiwan? What happens if he's serious about trying to break the Constitution and going for a third term? There's been suggestions he might try to copy what Putin did back when Putin, of course, broke the Russian Constitution that said you can't go for more than 2 terms. And then, if he does that, then he gets to handpick his successor because he's basically become an authoritative leader at that point. So all sorts of, if it wasn't so serious for the impacts on Canada, as a political scientist, I'd be saying, "Wow, this is great to be watching all this stuff." Who says that any of these Canada-U.S. politics is boring?
Yeah, Viktor Orban as well in Hungary, I guess, would be an apt example. And just a caveat too, I say charismatic, but also want to acknowledge, it's unfortunate that there's an appetite for someone who I suppose behaves like and says things like President Trump says. But you said, as you said, these don't seem to be normal times, and it's conceivable that you could pick any of the one things Trump has said or done in his 2 tenures, and that could have very well been a career president-ending incident in more quote-unquote normal times, I suppose, right? Well, Rob, the answer to the first 2 questions has kind of been Trump. I wonder if this will be the answer to the next question as well. But looking ahead, what issues do you see are most likely to matter in the coming year? And maybe could you reflect on the challenges, developments, decisions ahead that we need to watch for in the new year and beyond?
Well, I think in terms of the international security environment, the big thing that we have to be watching is what exactly the Russians and the Chinese take from this seemingly move to isolationism on the part of the Americans when they're basically saying, yeah, we really don't care. The terms of capitulation that Trump negotiated with the Russians for the Ukrainians, suggests that the Ukrainians are going to face dire times. And so the question becomes, if in fact that we see a Russian victory against the Ukrainians, and that was the so-called, I don't want to call it a peace plan, because it wasn't a peace plan. It was, Ukraine, you have to surrender and accept all of Russia's terms in that context. I didn't see a single one of the Ukrainian terms within that. And of course, if you're invaded, how do you see any of your terms? And so I think that I'll be watching what happens in Ukraine, and then what the Russians then do in terms of the region. We're seeing all sorts of signs that the Russians are actually ramping up their pressures on their neighbors. The drone attacks, the incidences along the borders with Poland and the Baltic states. I think that we're going to be seeing a Russia that continues to be an aggressor on its eastern border. Will it be regional? Will it be global? This is the thing that we need to be watching. And of course, many of the Chinese experts have been commentating on the buildup of the exercises that the Chinese have been doing off the coast of Taiwan. And again, from a historical perspective, when an authoritative state does that, it usually is a precursor to the actual use of force. Sometimes it is, it is just an act onto itself to try to intimidate the Taiwanese, but generally speaking, it's usually a forecast of conflict coming. So that's going to be probably within the international system, I think, the critical point beyond the Americans. The point for Canada is just how serious are we about this rearmament? I mean, I've written throughout the year that I really think that it is, on the one hand, it's good that we're having these serious discussions and we seem to be having serious solutions that are being put forward for the most part. But again, I fear that it is very akin to when Canada woke up in late 1938, 1939, and said, "Oh, we better start rearming. The Germans and the Italians are not as nice as we thought they were." And of course, most of our efforts were very late. Now, the technology was different, so that by the time our industrialization for our military was kicking in, which we could argue end of 42, middle of 1943, it made a difference. I fear, given the level of technologies that now exist, even though that we're taking this very serious, mostly, that in fact it may be a little too late, a little too to be able to really have a meaningful effect in either deterring our enemies or in actually being able to fight against our enemies. And that, I think, is going to be sort of the last major thing that I will be watching. Oh, and I should add, I'll continue to watch the thing that always slips by the radar, and that is the vastly and rapidly changing nuclear deterrent system. Again, people don't pay attention to it, but the Americans are in the midst of the most massive modernization. Every single one of their delivery systems is being replaced as we speak. I mean, I think the Columbia gets launched in about a year's time. They're already flying the prototype for the B-22, the B-21. I think Sentinel starts replacing Minuteman this year. And of course, they've already introduced the air-launched cruise missiles. We also have to be watching the Chinese. They've doubled from 300 to 600 nuclear warheads for their arsenal, and most observers are suggesting that they'll probably try to get up to about 1,000 by the time we get to the end of the decade. And the Russians will continue to perfect their delivery systems as they employ them in Ukraine. And so I think we also have to be watching this. That seems to be in the background because everybody's assumed nuclear weapons and the deterrent system of the Cold War died back in 1988. And yet the expenditures of the three great powers suggest that simply is not true. But we've got the new technologies, as I've argued in other forums, that really are going to undermine the core concepts of deterrence, and that is proper warning. And then that feeds back to Canada being serious about its defense, and that's why I suspect we'll see the focus, no matter how distasteful for many working with the Trump administration, it will come back that we will have to take serious the modernization of NORAD, presuming that NORAD continues to exist in the face of the American reorganization of their military structure.
Dr. Rob Hubert, thanks for joining us on an early Thursday morning to reflect on this rapidly changing, crazy, but above all, interesting world. Thanks also for your participation in CDAI programming and events over the past year. It's been a pleasure having your thought, leadership, and expertise involved in some of our endeavors, and really hope to continue engaging with you more in the new year. We're lucky enough to close out the episode with Wendy Gilmour, Vice Chair of the CDA Institute Board of Directors, former High Commissioner of Canada to Pakistan, and former NATO Assistant Secretary General for Defense Investment. Wendy, it's always a pleasure for you to join us. Thanks so much for taking some time ahead of the holidays to talk to us one last time this year.
My pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Wendy, I've been at the CDA Institute over 5 years now, and I want to say personally for me, I think this year may have been the most consequential or newsworthy year in my short tenure here. We've had everything from the announcement of the Defense Investment Agency to pledges to meet 2% of NATO defense spending, 5% by 2035. Then, of course, there was the election of President Donald Trump and everything that is sowed on the international stage and for Canada-US relations. Those are just a few of the things that have happened this year. So from your perspective, maybe looking back when it comes to this year in defense and security, what do you think were maybe the most notable or consequential developments of the year?
That's a tall order. You're absolutely right. It's been a big year. It's been a big year for Canadian defense and for Canada's understanding of our own sovereignty and what we need to do to defend it. It's also been a big year globally. These events are not just impacting Canada, they're impacting our traditional allies in Europe. We're getting a better understanding of how the US wants to position itself going forward. Yes, President Trump, but also more generally the changes inside the US system and how they might impact us. I think if I had to describe it in a soundbite worthy word, I would say that this was the year that the Canadian defense community and our government's perception of defense shifted from aspiration to obligation to delivery. It's the year in which everybody's sort of understanding the need to get real. It's the fact that the political events in Canada accelerated so that we have, while still a Liberal government, a new prime minister, new members in cabinet, that clear understanding of the reality that it wasn't good enough just to say we would eventually meet our NATO obligations, that we had a 2% aspiration down the road, but frankly, we're going to get to 2%. We're going to get to it in this fiscal year. That we accept, in fact, join with the NATO consensus on the need to move to a 5%, 3.5% in hard defense, 1.5% in dual-use infrastructure, and that there's a timeline and a plan and numbers in budget documents, which is very exciting for me at my core heart of an ex-bureaucrat, that there's a reality that there's a real desire to make this happen. I think we have this emergence of the sense, again, from my own background, I've been very preoccupied with defense industry and having the industrial base to meet our new reality. So there is a sense of industrial urgency. We have been promised over the course of the year from the platform that Prime Minister Carney took into the election to the throne speech that followed it, the promise of a defense industrial strategy. I understand it's nearly cooked and it's coming out. I think we can expect it probably early in the new year. And it will give the government a chance to really lay down its hard industrial plans, the monies of which there have been a whole variety of different announcements, the monies associated with it, but really to enunciate what type of industrial base do we need to meet this new strategic reality and how do we get there? And I think that's really exciting. The evolution in the broader fiscal outlook for the Canadian government and the impact that our changing trade relationship with the United States is having has meant that not only do we need to deliver defense capability, but we need to use the resources that are now assigned to defense to also catalyze the rest of the economy. And we need to do big nation building projects. And this country has never been more effective than when we rally around particular priorities. And, you know, from the first threat of invasion from a post-Civil War U.S., which led to the creation of Canada, if you go back 50 or so years before that, you have the end of the War of 1812, which led to the creation of the Rideau Canal, which was a defense project led by defense engineers. We have the post-war understanding of the then integration of the North American economy that led to the establishment of the St. Lawrence Seaway. So what are we going to do for this reality right now? And I think it will, and I know it sort of strays away from specifically the defense portfolio, but reducing barriers to internal trade, engineering sort of a revitalized and hopefully sustainable and environmentally responsible way to harvest the resources that Canada has available to it will assist in our ability to muster what we need to do for defense. And particularly, I think we need to understand and make sure that we've got a shared national vision around what, for us, strategic autonomy means. And I was looking, I'm sure many of our listeners have been looking at the recent U.S. national security strategy and this reiteration of the Monroe Doctrine with a Trump corollary, with our understanding of what does it mean to live next to a neighbor like the United States in both good years of relationship, and we've had many in our history, years of difficult relations with the U.S. And what it really means for Canada is that we need to show up for ourselves. And I think if nothing else this year, there is a growing understanding of the need amongst the Canadian population that investing in defense is not just being a good ally, it's about showing up for ourselves. So if I had to look at the hard questions coming up that have grown out of this year, I'd look at, hard choices on capabilities and spending. Where do we put these resources? I'd look at hard choices on who do we work with when we are looking to make the risk-based decisions. And this is a perennial sort of line that I try and flog with many audiences, but that ultimately the Canadian government has to make strategic decisions about where do we accept risk. Risk in rearming and recapitalizing Canadian forces. What do we make ourselves? What do we buy and build with allies? And what are we prepared to just go to the commercial market for? That's partly what I hope the defense industrial strategy will answer. And it means hard choices about how do we prioritize the defense of Canada within our understanding of what it means to be a defense of North America and what the Americans may plan for defense of North America, and how do we want to carve out our space to be able to frankly, to remain sovereign. And frankly, many franklies, but how do we look internationally at where the true threats are? And in recent days, and I think it's a wonderful sort of capstone on the year, we've had some really important speeches coming out of the UK that recognize that we are at war with Russia. We may be at war in a hybrid state. We may be better understanding that even if we don't believe ourselves to be in a kinetic war with Russia, they believe they are in a war with NATO allies, and by extent, NATO interests. And we have to be prepared for that. So the most exciting thing, I think, coming out of this year is also, the most dangerous, but it's recognizing opportunity in crisis. And it's getting right, finally, how we want to defend a sovereign Canada, make our own strategic decisions, and frankly, making sure that everybody's putting their money where their mouth is.
Well, those are fantastic reflections, Wendy. If I may, I am hoping to ask two really quick follow-up questions. You've discussed it already, but I guess on one hand, do you think that we can sustain the interest and efforts, both from the public and the government, to build upon this momentum we've made in the past year with defense investments? And slightly unrelated, but related enough, I was speaking to General Tom Lawson for this podcast as well in regards to the United States national security strategy and President Trump. He said, and I'm slightly paraphrasing, that it's unlikely that the United States will be able to sort of lead the world morally and democratically as it once did. So with that said, let's say there's an end to Trumpism, or this era of United States history ends and we kind of go back to a normalcy, if you will. Can we still trust the United States as an ally, or has too much damage been done over the past year or so?
I think I would answer to some degree a little bit of both questions by starting off with, and I really should be able to attribute the quotes I use much better, but there was a British Prime Minister who said, "Events, dear boy, events." Maybe Clement Attlee? I'm not entirely sure. I'd have to go back and check. But the principle of that is, how do we sustain the Canadian public's willingness to invest in our defense and security? Well, that speaks to their perception and understanding of the threat. And I can say that threat is not going away. I would love it if it did. Believe me, if there was a peace dividend and we could spend all of our discretionary government resources in helping the education and development of the Canadian public, that would be great. But you cannot have development. You cannot have a secure citizenry and a great investment climate in the absence of security. And so that means we need to invest in our security. And that means, ultimately, investing in our security means a capable Canadian forces able to operate in a sovereign manner And it means to the greatest extent possible, we have to exert the levers of influence we have to help create the world or to influence those elements of the world to make it safe for ourselves. And we are, I hate the expression middle power. We are not a middle. If you look at the 200 plus nations that are out there, we're well on the top. We are a wealthy nation. We have a relatively smaller population, but I think we're 9th or 10th largest economy in the world still. We need to figure out how to use that leverage to, frankly, advance our own interests. With respect to the United States, I personally do not believe that this is a President Trump problem or even his administration's problem. I think the world, as we have seen it evolve in the post-Second World War order, has reached its natural limit. It's very unfortunate because there were very positive parts of that world. But frankly, we are in a world now where the Western nations no longer are the wealthiest and most powerful nations on earth. If you add up the economies of China, India, Brazil, and other growing economic powers in what we had for many years just called the developing world. Well, many of them are sort of developed and they're there now. And we have to understand how we interact in that world. And when we when we understand that the world also includes actors which may be working against our own interests, and that can be in a malign way. It can also be in a very self-interested way. And I think where the U.S. is at the moment is that the symptom which has produced disease, which is some of what we see, the behaviors coming out of the current administration of President Trump, is it's the U.S. acting in what it believes is its own self-interest. Canada has to move beyond being what economists would call freeloading. We have freeloaded on defense. We freeloaded on the leadership that the U.S. has played in the world up to this point because it's been benign for us. We have freeloaded, maybe extending it a bit too far, but we have taken advantage of our proximity to what was really an easy market to invest in and to export into. And those were the right decisions for the right time, as I believed. I mean, I think free trade, which is never really free trade, it's managed trade, but a managed trading relationship in which we have good access to a large, wealthy market like the U.S. has been great for Canada. We cannot count on that always being there. So that means we have to, pull up our socks and figure out what our priorities are. What market access do we wish to preserve, and what are we willing to pay for? What sovereign military capability do we wish to have, and what are we prepared to pay for? And frankly, what are we prepared to do without in order to ensure security, autonomy, sovereignty? And those are really difficult decisions for any government moving forward. But good governance and pragmatic leadership has been a hallmark of Canada over the 158 years of our existence. And so I will end on an optimistic note and thinking that we have the fundamentals at the moment to move forward, but that political attention and frankly, Canadian public's attention to understanding what these choices might imply is going to be really important moving forward.
Well, I think, Wendy, in our short time here, you've covered the waterfront practically. Some very sobering, but also eloquent and, as you said, optimistic reflections on what's ahead for Canada. Wendy, I want to thank you once again for joining me today right before the holidays. And thanks for all you've done for supporting CDAI programming and for national defense more broadly. Look forward to having you on more and engaging with you in the new year as well.
Thank you very much, and a very happy Christmas and happy holidays to all those celebrating and to the CDAI team in particular.
That's all for today's episode, and that's all for Season 4 of the CDA Institute's Expert Series. If you want to learn more about the CDA Institute, follow us on social media, visit our website at cdainstitute.ca, or subscribe to our newsletter for the latest updates on Canadian defense and international security. If you have comments or feedback about what you heard in today's edition, email josh@cdainstitute.ca. I'm Josh Malm, and we'll see you again on Friday, January 9th, 2026. Thanks for tuning in.